Glad you guys could brave the weather coming out here. Man, it was pretty nasty in Joplin the past couple of days. It was 21 degrees yesterday, but it felt like 5 is what it said. And the wind chill was atrocious. It was just gross. And so even just walking from the dorm to like the cafeteria, you got to bundle up and just try to brave the wind, and it's just awful. And so, thanks for coming out today. But if you were here last week, we started a new series going through the story of Jonah. I'm really excited about this series. I think it's going to be really good. And so we're going to be continuing walking through that today. So if you haven't already, go ahead and take out your Bibles and turn to Jonah chapter 1. That's where we'll be today. So last week was kind of an introduction to our story when we looked over the first 3 verses of Jonah. We learned what kind of person Jonah was. And even though he was a prophet, I argued that he was actually the worst prophet in the entire Bible. We also learned that Jonah was a huge nationalist, someone who cared a whole lot, probably a little bit too much, about the advancement and progress of his nation, Israel. Which makes God's command to Jonah just that much more interesting. As we saw last week, God's command to tell Jonah to go to Nineveh was the first time God had ever told one of his prophets to go to an outside nation, a foreign city. This was crazy. And we also learned what kind of a place Nineveh was, and what kind of people lived there. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, one of the worst and cruelest nations in all of human history. They were well known for their brutal warfare and immoral lifestyle. They would humiliate their opponents, one of which happened to be Israel. So in the beginning of our story, we have God telling Jonah, a hugely nationalistic and patriotic member of Israel, to go to help the enemies of his country. It wasn't too hard to figure out why Jonah decided to flee the Lord. It wasn't too hard to figure that out. He said no thanks. And we saw last week that he actually did the exact opposite of what God told him to do. God told him to go east, so he went west. God told him to go by land, so he went by boat. God told him to go to the big city, so he got a one-way ticket to the end of the world, Joppa. So building off last week, let's continue our story. So last week we covered the first 3 verses of Jonah. Today, it's going to be pretty similar, not a whole lot covered. Actually, today we'll be looking more into verse 3 and just into verse 4. So not a whole lot. So I know some of you are probably thinking like, man, why are we only covering like 1 or 2 verses? This is nothing. Like, we just jump into it already. This is the second week. We should be like in the 2nd chapter by now. So I get that, but the first like 8, 9, 10 verses of Jonah are crucial for building up the rest of the story. So I want to make sure that we take our time through this beginning portion so that we can understand the rest of the story, chapters 2, 3, 4, when we get there. So today, we're just going to cover 3 and 4. I think it's important. Like I said last week, Jonah has a mountain of scholarship on it, and it's an incredible, intricately crafted piece of literature that is rich for application. So there's a ton that we can pull from it, and I want to try to get as much as we can. So think of this story, think of the series as a succession. Each week builds off of the next, all right? And so this is just the second in our 9-week series. So we're still at the beginning. So if you turn your Bibles to Jonah, let's look at our text this morning. I want to start from the very beginning of Jonah, even though we read it last week, and then we'll go to verse 4. So Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. So that's what we'll be focusing on today, just verse 3 and then mostly 4. So there's a storybook for children called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. And it's just a children's book, so it's a very simple tale. It's a nice little story, at least on the surface it is. Because I think this story has a tremendous symbolic meaning. The story goes, there's a small boy named Billy Bixby, that's his name, just a little elementary school boy, and he wakes up one morning to a small dragon on the foot of his bed, just about the size of a house cat. He's really friendly, really nice. So he gets up out of bed and he runs downstairs to tell his mom about the dragon that he found. She looks at him and kind of laughs and says, "Silly boy, there's no such thing as dragons." So he's a little discouraged, but once she said that, the dragon began to grow. And it pretty soon eats all of Billy's pancakes. And it soon fills the whole house. Every time Billy tries to tell his mom that there's a dragon, she denies it. And with each time she denies it, it gets bigger and bigger. Mom tries to vacuum the house, but she has to go in and out of the house through the windows because the dragon is everywhere. And it takes forever, but she still denies that there's a dragon in the house, even though it's starting to seem obvious by now. But then one day the dragon got so big, it took the entire house. It literally took it up into the air. So Dad got home from work one day, he's driving, and he gets to where his house used to be, and it's just an empty plot of land. So he has to get help from the mailman to help him find where his house is. So he goes chasing down after the dragon, and pretty soon he finds it, gets out of his car, walks up the tail, the back, up the neck, and then in the front door to join his family. Just like nothing ever happened. Just like nothing ever happened. But pretty soon, Billy, who pretty much had it by now, takes his mother by the shoulders and insists, "Mom, there is a dragon in our house. There is a dragon. How can you not see this?" And she looks at him kind of puzzled, and she thinks to herself, and she says, "You know what, maybe you're right. Maybe there is a dragon." And as soon as she said that, the dragon began to shrink. It got smaller and smaller, and pretty soon, after a few days, it was just back to its normal size of a cat. Harmless and friendly. The mom's eyes were open by this point, and she asked why the dragon had to get so big. Why did it have to grow? Why did it have to grow that big? To that, Billy quietly answered, maybe it wanted to be noticed. Maybe it wanted to be noticed. This is a children's book, but I think it's much more than that. Let's tuck that away in our back of our minds because we'll come back to that later. Let's look back to our story in Jonah, looking at verse 4. Jonah runs from God, but God won't let him get away so easily. It says the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. In some other translations, the word for sent is actually hurled. God hurled a great wind on the sea. The word for hurled is the same used to describe throwing a weapon like a spear. This is violent. This was an awful storm. The word used for great to describe the storm is the same word actually used to describe how great of a city that Nineveh was. This was a great city. This was a great storm. If Jonah refuses to go into a great city, he will go into a great storm. From this, we can learn two things. This verse tells us two things. It gives us some news. It gives us some dismaying news, but also it gives us some comforting news. So first, let's cover the dismaying news. The dismaying news is that every act of disobedience to God has a storm attached to it. Every act of disobedience to God has a storm attached to it. This is one of the great themes of the Old Testament wisdom literature in books such as Proverbs and Song of Solomon and Psalms, the wisdom literature. Now, when I say that every act of disobedience to God has a storm attached to it, I want to be careful here and tell you what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying by that is that every difficult thing that comes into our lives is the punishment for some particular sin we committed. That is not what I'm saying. That's completely different from what I'm saying. If you lie to your husband and then later that day you stub your toe, there's no correlation there. That's not how this works, okay? That's not how this works. And the same goes for the flip side of that. By doing good, Jesus doesn't promise us that we will become wealthy and our health will be perfect and we'll never have to go through anything tough in life. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's a very simple view of sin. So you guys have probably heard of this guy named Joel Osteen, right? You guys have probably heard of who that is. So he's the pastor of the largest church in America down in Houston, Texas. But Joel Osteen, you've probably seen videos of him on Facebook or something like that. A great motivational speaker, but his message isn't exactly what the gospel is. His message is a little alternative. It's different. It's called the prosperity gospel. At the center of the gospel of Jesus is his sacrifice, death, and resurrection. He died on our behalf so we don't have to carry the weight of our sin. We're free in Jesus. That's not exactly what Joel Osteen teaches. The prosperity gospel teaches that if you obey God and you do good deeds, you feed the homeless, you tithe 10%, you never swear, you treat your family well, you're an upstanding citizen. If you do all that, God will bless you with wealth and good health, and you will never experience hardship. Let me tell you this morning, that is not at all what the Bible teaches. That is a lie. That is a lie.
The entire book of Job contradicts Joel Osteen and the prosperity gospel. The book of Job contradicts the common belief that good people will have lives that go well, and that if your life is going badly, it must be your fault. You must have committed some kind of sin. That's why something bad is happening to you. The Bible does not say that every difficulty is a result of sin, but listen, it does teach that every sin will bring you difficulty. You see that subtlety right there? Every sin will bring you difficulty. If we directly disobey God and run from Him, just like Jonah, we can expect to experience a storm. We can expect to experience a storm. We cannot treat our bodies indifferently and still expect to have good health. We cannot treat people indifferently and expect to maintain their friendship. We cannot all put our selfish interests ahead of the common good and still have a functioning society. That's not how the world works. If we violate the design and purpose of things, if we sin against our bodies, our relationship, and our society, they're going to strike back. They're going to strike back. We will face hardship because of that. The Bible speaks sometimes about God punishing sin, but other times the sin itself punishes us. Both are true. All sin has a storm attached to it. Just like denying that there's a dragon in your house, just like denying that you have a problem, just like holding in all of the sin in your life, withholding all of the garbage and baggage within you. Eventually, it will catch up with you. Eventually, the dragon will grow so big that you just can't handle it yourself anymore. So the result of Jonah's disobedience to God is a storm. The results of Jonah's sin is immediate and dramatic, but this isn't always true in our lives. We don't always see the result of sin right away. There's something really interesting that I read recently about frogs. Frogs are pretty interesting, but they're kind of gross. But I read that if you you get a pot of water and you boil it, boiling water, and you throw a frog in there, he'll immediately jump out. Like, oh, that's hot, I don't want to be in there, obviously. That's pretty obvious, frog is going to jump out. But I read that if you get a pot of water and it's cold, and you throw the frog in there, he'll sit in there. And then if you slowly heat up the temperature, slowly and slowly, up to a boiling point, the frog won't notice, and it'll sit there. And it'll actually die because it can't tell the difference. It will literally do that. I think that's so fascinating. But this is the effect of sin in our life. You start by doing something really small and seemingly insignificant, but with each time you do it, it becomes harder and harder to stop. Just like the frog who can't tell the difference between the temperature of the water. It will eventually die because it can't tell the difference. Every time you think to yourself, oh, that's no big deal, with every time it gets worse and worse. Just like denying that there's a dragon, it will get bigger and bigger and take up your whole house. Sin is like taking an addictive drug. At first it may feel wonderful, but every time it gets harder and harder to stop. All sin has a mighty storm attached to it. The image of a storm is so powerful even today, even in our technologically advanced society, because we still cannot control the weather. With all the things that we can control, all the smart cars and skyscrapers and planes, and we still can't control the weather. All sin has a storm attached to it. And if you pay close attention, it's not just Jonah that is stuck in the storm here on the boat. It's all the other sailors as well. Jonah has put them in danger because of his own sin. Our sin affects other people more than we may even realize. Just like denying that there's a dragon, it grows and grows until it affects the entire family. The father can't even find his way home. In that little story, the children's story, I think there's a much deeper meaning to it. I don't think the dragon is actually a dragon. I don't think so. I think the dragon symbolizes sin. Symbolizes a family secret. A secret that nobody wants to talk about, all because you don't want to add drama to that. And we can do that. This stuff happens even in places like Madison, Kansas. Even when your families are so big and close. There are issues and people that you just don't talk about because you don't want to add to that. There are issues that probably need to be discussed and worked through, but you just ignore it. You don't want to deal with that. You just don't want to do that. You don't talk about that uncle or that grandson or that mother-in-law. That's the attitude we have until the problem grows and grows until it's too late. Until the dragon takes the whole house and all the sin takes the whole family. This is why people get divorces. It's why there's lack of communication. It's why people have affairs. It's It's why people aren't happy in their marriages, because you're not talking about the actual issues that need to be discussed. There's only one way to defeat the sin in your life that nags at you each and every day. There's only one way. Only one way. You talk about it. You let it out. That thing that nags at you each and every day that you think about, that it has so much power because you keep it inside. But once you share it, once it's out there and someone else knows, it's powerless. It loses all its power. It's nothing. But it all comes back to that first step. You have to say something. That first step is the hardest one. Share it. Share about it. This practice is often called confession. The practice of confession is often associated with the Catholic Church. Confession is a central part of their faith. Usually when we think of confession, we think of confessional booths. Those little wooden booths where the priest sits on one side and you sit on the other, and there's kind of this like mesh wall in between you, so it's confidential. You can't see each other. But you're able to just confess freely your sin to the priest. And you feel so free afterwards. It's such a cool practice that is central to the Catholic faith. Honestly, it's crucial to the Christian faith more than just the Catholic faith. But for some reason, we have lost this practice of confession. We don't really do it anymore. We live in a world that tells you that you can do anything you want if you just believe in yourself. You can live off of your own power, off of your own strength. You just have to try a little bit harder. That's all you need. You can be anything you want to as long as you just believe in yourself. That's all you need. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I think we can learn from the Catholic Church here, because I believe confession is crucial to our faith. Now I know going to a Catholic church isn't probably something that you're probably going to do, go and confess to a priest. You don't have to do that to practice confession. But what I do suggest is to find that one person in your life that you trust, and that one person in your life that you can tell your whole life to, and confess to them the things that are building up inside of you, because it's not good to keep those things on the inside, because it will eat away at you, and eventually your sin will catch up with you. It's going to catch up to you. Numbers 32:23 says, "You will be sinning against the Lord, and you will be sure that your sin will find you out." All sin has a mighty storm attached to it. So the dismaying news from verse 4 is that sin always has a storm attached to it. So we covered the dismaying news, so now let's set that aside and let's cover the comforting news. The comforting news. For Jonah, the storm was the consequence of his sin. And as we see, the sailors are also caught in the storm with him. Yet, as we will see in the following verses, following 4, the storm actually leads the sailors to genuine faith in God. Through the storm, they actually find faith in God. That's pretty remarkable. Jonah himself begins his journey to understand the grace of God in a new way. When storms come into our lives, whether as a consequence of our wrongdoing or not, Christians have the promise that God will use them for their good. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." When God wanted to make Abraham into a man of faith, he could be he could be the father of all the faithful on the earth, but he put him through years of wandering with apparently unfulfilled promises. When God wanted to turn Joseph from an arrogant, deeply spoiled teenager into a man of character, he put him through the experience of slavery and imprisonment before he could save his people. Moses had to become a fugitive and spend 40 years in the lonely wilderness before he could become a leader, before he could accomplish anything. The Bible does not say that every difficulty is a result of our sin, but it does teach that for Christians, every difficulty can help reduce the power of sin in our hearts. Difficulty can actually play a positive role in our lives. Storms wake us up to truths that we would otherwise never see. Storms develop faith and love and hope and faithfulness and humility that nothing else can. It can be hard to try to discern God's purposes behind our suffering, but as we talked about last week, we need to trust that God has our best interest in mind. He actually wants what's best for us. There's a man named Fyodor Dostoevsky. He's a Russian author, one of the greatest minds of the 19th century. You've probably heard some of his books, such as Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov, which have deep philosophical implications. They're absolutely amazing pieces of work. But Dostoevsky was a Christian, but he wasn't always a Christian. At the beginning of his life, he kind of lived like most people, just kind of drifting about, just kind of doing his own thing, minding his own business. But he was a part of this political group, and this group got arrested one day because the Tsar of Russia, the king of Russia, decided that their actions were treasonous. They were against his power. And so the king arrested him, and he lined the whole group up one day. He decided to sentence them to death. So he lined them all up, blindfolded them, and tied their hands behind their back. And they were to die from firing squad. So they all stood there with a huge crowd, all of them mocking them, yelling and screaming, and they just kind of stood there, waiting for them to die. They had no idea when this was happening. And then finally they heard marches coming up of the soldiers that were going to stand right in front of them. And then they hear the firing squad leader, ready, aim. They hear the guns cocked back, and they're aimed, ready to go. It's any second now, it's going to happen. And then immediately they hear footsteps coming out from the background, and it's this man running out, says, "Stop, wait!" And he has a prearranged message from the king saying, "No, wait, never mind, I don't want to kill you anymore. Instead, you're just going to do hard labor in prison." So they all took off their blindfolds, and they're just shocked at what just happened. They were this close to death, and they just nearly escaped. Well, Dostoevsky never recovered from that incident. He never recovered from that. And so on his way to the prison, there was this woman on the bus, and she handed him a New Testament. And he, while in prison, pored over that New Testament. He thought of this as God giving him a second chance. If he would come that close to death and escape, he wouldn't waste the rest of his life again. He wouldn't waste the rest of his life. He even writes about it. He says, "Now my life will change. I will be born again in new form." He believed that this was God helping him through this hardship to give him strength and humility and faith. After 10 years of prison, he emerged as an unshakable Christian. He writes one of his famous passages. He says, if anyone proved to me that Christ was outside the truth, then I would prefer to remain with Christ than with the truth. He was strong. Jonah could not see that deep within the terror of the storm. God's mercy was at work, drawing him back to change his heart. It's no surprise that Jonah missed this initially. He didn't know how God would come into the world to save us. He didn't know that Jesus would come to save the world because Jesus hadn't been born yet. He wasn't alive. He didn't have that luxury of knowing that. We, however, have an advantage that Jonah did not. We live on the other side of Jesus. We know that God can save through weakness, suffering, and defeat. Those who watched Jesus die on the cross saw nothing but tragedy and horror. They didn't see God working behind the scenes because God knew that Jesus would resurrect and save all of mankind. He can work through that hardship. There's deep mercy inside of our storms. Let's pray. God, thank you for the storms in our lives, even though that's really hard to say sometimes. It's for our best interest. Help us believe that you have what's best for us in mind. Because I believe you do. I believe that's what the Bible teaches. Lord, help us to look through Jonah and find flaws in our own lives that we can change. Lord, help us to be a light in this town and in our communities. Thank you so much for your mercy and grace. Even though we don't deserve it, even though we don't understand it, you still give it freely to us. It's in your name I pray. Amen.
For our decision hymn, we'll turn to page 301. We'll stand and sing the first and last